It was just a photo of a mother and son in 1885, but their hands reveal a dark secret. The Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division receives donations of historical photographs regularly, each one a fragment of American history preserved in silver and paper. Most arrive with minimal documentation, requiring curators to piece together stories from visual evidence and archival research. But on a humid morning in August 2024, curator Dr. Eleanor Hayes opens a package that will lead her to uncover one of the most harrowing cases of post-emancipation domestic servitude and abuse ever documented in photographic evidence. The donation comes from an estate sale in Charleston, South Carolina. The accompanying letter explains that the photograph was discovered in a trunk of materials belonging to the Preston family, one of Charleston's oldest and most prominent white families. The executor, handling the estate after the last Preston descendant died without heirs, thought the photograph might have historical significance because of a note attached to it that suggested there was more to the story than the image shows. Eleanor carefully removes a large albumen print from its archival sleeve. The photograph is remarkably well preserved, mounted on heavy cardboard with gilt edges. A photographer's embossed mark on the mounting reads, Whitfield Studio, Charleston, South Carolina, March 1885. The image shows a formal studio portrait of a black woman and a young black boy, photographed against a painted backdrop suggesting an elegant interior. The woman sits in an ornately carved chair with elaborate scrollwork, her posture upright and rigid. She appears to be in her late 30s, wearing a dark, high-neck dress with a fitted bodice and decorative pleating down the front. The dress is well-made, respectable, the kind worn by domestic servants in wealthy households rather than field workers or the desperately poor. Standing beside her is a boy of perhaps 7 or 8 years old, dressed in a neatly tailored suit with a vest and tie clothing that speaks of care and some measure of means. His left hand rests on his mother's shoulder, the gesture protective despite his young age. His right arm hangs straight at his side, his small hand clenched into a fist. Both mother and son stare directly at the camera with expressions that are carefully neutral, unsmiling in the way typical of the era's long exposure times. But there's something in their eyes that Eleanor recognizes from years of studying photographs of black Americans from this period, a wariness, a weight, an awareness of danger that no formal pose could completely hide. Eleanor pulls out her magnifying glass and examines the photograph more closely. That's when she sees what makes this image extraordinary and deeply disturbing. The woman's hands rest carefully on her lap, positioned in a way that seems deliberately displayed for the camera, and across both hands, particularly visible on the knuckles and upper fingers, are faint, linear scars. The scarring is extensive, creating a pattern of raised tissue that's visible even through the photograph's sepia tones. These aren't the calluses and minor injuries from ordinary domestic work. These are the marks of severe, repeated trauma. Eleanor zooms in on high-resolution scans of the photograph. The scars form patterns, some linear, suggesting cuts or strikes with implements, others more irregular, possibly from burns or crushing injuries. The woman's right hand shows particularly severe scarring across the knuckles, as if the bones had been broken and healed poorly. But there's something else. Eleanor examines the boy's hands more closely. His left hand, resting on his mother's shoulder, appears normal for a child his age. But his right hand, hanging at his side and clenched into a fist, when Eleanor enhances the image, she can see that his thumb is positioned oddly, as if it doesn't bend correctly. The joint appears damaged or malformed. Eleanor turns the photograph over. The back of the mounting board has an inscription in faded brown ink, Eliza and Thomas Freeman, March 1885, commissioned by the Preston household. And below that, in different handwriting, added much later in pencil, someone has written, Eliza's hands tell the story she could never speak. Mrs. Preston broke them. Thomas tried to stop her. Look closely at what they survived. Eleanor reads the inscription 3 times, her heart pounding. The photograph was commissioned by the Preston household, the same family whose estate donated it. And someone, decades later, had understood that Eliza Freeman's scarred hands documented abuse, that her son Thomas had tried to intervene and been hurt himself, that this formal portrait preserved evidence of violence that couldn't be spoken about openly in 1885 Charleston. Eleanor spends the rest of that day beginning her research. She searches census records and finds Eliza Freeman listed in the 1880 Charleston census as a 32-year-old black woman, widowed, working as a domestic servant, with one son, Thomas, age 3. By 1885, when the photograph was taken, Eliza would have been 37 and Thomas would have been 8, matching the apparent ages in the portrait. But when Eleanor searches for Eliza's employer in 1880, she finds her listed as living in the household of Richard and Margaret Preston at their residence on Meeting Street, one of Charleston's most prestigious addresses. The 1,880 census shows the Preston household included Richard Preston, age 55, occupation cotton merchant, his wife Margaret, age 48, 3 adult children, and 3 black servants, including Eliza Freeman. Eleanor searches for more information about the Preston family and finds extensive documentation. Richard Preston had inherited wealth from his father's pre-war cotton plantation. After the Civil War, he transitioned to cotton trading and shipping, maintaining his family's prominence and fortune. The Prestons were described in Charleston society pages as pillars of the community, active in their church, respected business leaders. But Eleanor knows that respectability in 1,880 seconds, Charleston often concealed the brutal reality of how white families treated black domestic workers. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery in 1865, but in the 20 years since, new systems of control and exploitation had emerged. Black domestic workers lived in their employers' homes, worked from dawn to late night, received minimal wages if any, and had no legal protection from abuse. The system wasn't called slavery anymore, but for many black women working as domestics, the lack of freedom and the constant threat of violence were hardly different from what their mothers had endured in bondage. Eleanor contacts Dr. Marcus Washington, a historian at the College of Charleston who specializes in the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction periods in South Carolina, particularly the experiences of black domestic workers and the violence they faced. Marcus has spent years documenting cases of abuse that were hidden behind the facade of respectable Southern families. Marcus calls her back within 2 hours. The Preston family. I know that name. There were rumors for years about how Margaret Preston treated her servants. Send me everything you have, especially the photograph. If Eliza Freeman's hands show that level of scarring, we need to find out exactly what happened in that house. Eleanor emails him the high-resolution images and the inscription. They arrange to meet at the South Carolina Historical Society in Charleston, where Marcus has already requested records related to the Preston family, court documents, newspaper archives from the 1,880 seconds, and any available records from black churches and mutual aid societies that might have documented abuse cases. That evening, Eleanor can't stop thinking about the photograph. She enlarges images of Eliza Freeman's face, studying her expression. The careful composure, the direct gaze at the camera, the set of her jaw that suggests determination despite everything she'd endured. And those hands, deliberately positioned to be visible in the photograph, displaying scars that told a story of systematic violence. And Thomas, just 7 or 8 years old, standing protectively beside his mother, his hand on her shoulder, his other hand clenched in a fist with a damaged thumb. Thomas tried to stop her. The inscription had said, what had this child witnessed? What had he tried to do to protect his mother? And what price had he paid for that attempt? Eleanor meets Marcus at the South Carolina Historical Society 3 days later. The archivist has pulled extensive materials, Preston family papers, Charleston newspapers from 1,880 to 1,890, court records, and importantly, documents from the Mother Emanuel AME Church, one of Charleston's oldest black churches, which had kept records of their congregation members' struggles during this period. They divide the work systematically. Marcus takes the church records and Black Mutual Aid Society documents while Eleanor examines Preston family papers and court records. They agree to trade after 2 hours and compare findings. Within the first hour, Marcus finds references to Eliza Freeman in the church records. From the Mother Emanuel AME church membership rolls, he discovers that Eliza had been an active member since 1878, shortly after arriving in Charleston from a rural area. The church had a benevolent committee that tried to provide support to members facing hardship, and Eliza's name appears multiple times in their confidential meeting minutes. From March 1882, Sister Eliza Freeman requests prayers for strength in her employment situation. She reports difficulties with her employer but fears losing her position if she complains publicly. The committee offered what support we can, though we acknowledge our limited power to protect domestic workers from mistreatment in white households. From November 1883, Sister Eliza Freeman attended services with visible injuries to her hands and arms. When asked, she stated she had an accident while working. Several sisters expressed concern that these injuries appear consistent with deliberate harm rather than accidents. Sister Freeman requests that we not make inquiries, as she fears repercussions if her employer learns she has spoken about her situation. From June 1884, Sister Eliza Freeman's son Thomas, age 7, was brought to the church by his mother. The boy has injuries to his right hand that prevent him from fully using his thumb. Sister Freeman states the boy injured himself while trying to protect her from punishment by her employer, Mrs. Margaret Preston. This is the first time Sister Freeman has named her employer directly. She fears for both her safety and her son's, but states she has no other means of supporting herself and cannot leave her position. Marcus shows Eleanor the church records, his expression grim. Eliza was documenting the abuse through the church, creating a record even though she couldn't seek legal help. And Thomas was injured trying to defend his mother when he was only 7 years old. Eleanor has found even more disturbing information in court records. She discovers that in August 1884, just 2 months after the church recorded Thomas's injury, a complaint was filed with the Charleston police by a white woman named Catherine Morrison, who was a neighbor of the Prestons. The complaint states, "I wish to report my concerns about the treatment of colored servants in the Preston household on Meeting Street. I have on multiple occasions witnessed Mrs. Margaret Preston striking her servants with various implements, canes, kitchen tools, and once a fireplace poker. The violence is severe enough that I can hear it from my property despite the substantial distance between our homes. I have seen one servant, a woman named Eliza, with visible injuries to her hands and face. I believe Mrs. Preston is engaging in criminal assault, and I request that authorities investigate," but attached to the complaint is a police report dated 3 days later. Investigation conducted at Preston residence, Mrs. Margaret Preston interviewed. She states that discipline of colored servants is necessary to maintain proper household order, and that any injuries to servants result from their own clumsiness or resistance to legitimate correction. Mr. Richard Preston confirms his wife's account. The servant Eliza Freeman was interviewed and stated that all injuries were accidental and that she is treated fairly. Given that the servant herself denies mistreatment and that discipline of servants is within the rights of employers, no further action will be taken. Mrs. Catherine Morrison is advised that interference in the domestic arrangements of other households is inappropriate. Eliza was forced to lie to protect herself and Thomas, Marcus says. If she'd confirmed the abuse, the Prestons would have fired her immediately, and she'd have no way to support her son. Or worse, they might have found ways to punish her more severely or even have her arrested on false charges. She had no choice but to deny everything. They continue searching through records, and Eleanor finds something that makes her call Marcus over urgently. In the Preston family papers, there's correspondence between Margaret Preston and her sister in Atlanta. The letters are disturbing in their casual revelation of Margaret Preston's attitudes and actions. From a letter dated December 1883. "Dearest Caroline, you asked about my household management. I confess I have had to be quite firm with the colored girl Eliza, who serves as our cook and housemaid. These Negroes, now that they fancy themselves free, require constant reminding of their place. Eliza had the audacity to request higher wages, claiming she needed additional money for her son's schooling. I made clear to her that she receives fair compensation in room and board, and that any impertinence would not be tolerated. I struck her hands with a cane to emphasize the lesson she will not soon forget the consequences of making demands above her station." From January 1884, "The colored girl Eliza dropped a serving platter during dinner last week, embarrassing me before our guests. I cannot tolerate such incompetence. I ensured she understood the severity of her failure by striking her hands repeatedly with the fireplace poker. She will be more careful in future. Richard says I am too harsh with the servants, but he does not understand that without firm discipline, these Negroes will become unmanageable." From July 1884, "A most distressing incident occurred. I was disciplining Eliza for some minor infraction. I cannot even recall what prompted it when her young son burst into the room and actually attempted to prevent me from striking his mother. The impudence! I grabbed the boy's hand and twisted it until I heard something snap. Let him learn young that interference with white authority will not be tolerated. The boy now has some difficulty using his thumb, which I consider a permanent reminder of the consequences of his presumption." Eleanor and Marcus stare at the letters in horrified silence. Margaret Preston had documented her own abuse in casual correspondence, never imagining her letters would be preserved and one day serve as evidence of her crimes. She had systematically beaten Eliza Freeman's hands, specifically targeting them, causing permanent damage. And when 7-year-old Thomas had tried to defend his mother, Margaret had deliberately broken bones in his hand as punishment. "These letters are confession," Marcus says quietly. Margaret Preston admitted to assault, to deliberately causing permanent injury to a child. But she was never prosecuted because her victims were black and she was a wealthy white woman. They searched for what happened after the August 1884 complaint was dismissed by police. Church records show that Eliza continued to attend Mother Emanuel AME Church throughout 1884 and into 1885, but the Benevolent Committee notes indicate growing concern for her safety. From February 1885. Sister Eliza Freeman reports that Mrs. Preston's violence has escalated. Sister Freeman fears she may be seriously injured or killed if she continues in her current position. However, she has saved no money and has no family in Charleston to turn to for shelter. She feels trapped in circumstances that grow more dangerous daily. The committee discussed possible solutions, but acknowledges we have limited ability to protect Sister Freeman given the legal and social realities of our position. Then Eleanor finds something that explains why the photograph was commissioned. In the Preston family account books, there's an entry from March 1885. Payment to Whitfield Studio for portrait photograph of servants Eliza and Thomas Freeman, $5. Commissioned by Mrs. Preston. Margaret Preston had commissioned the photograph herself. But why would an abusive employer pay to have a formal portrait made of her servants? Marcus finds the answer in a letter from Margaret Preston to her sister dated March 1885. Dearest Caroline, I have had a photograph made of my servant Eliza and her son. You may think this an odd choice, but I have my reasons. There have been whispered criticisms from certain interfering neighbors about my household management. I intend to display this photograph as evidence that my servants are well treated, respectably dressed, and content in my service. The formal portrait demonstrates that I am a beneficent employer who provides for my servants' needs. Let my critics see this image and understand that any rumors of mistreatment are unfounded. Eliza and her boy are housed, clothed, and cared for. What more could Negroes in their position possibly require? Margaret Preston commissioned the photograph as propaganda, Eleanor says, understanding washing over her. She wanted to prove she was a good employer, to counter the complaints that had been filed. She dressed Eliza and Thomas in their best clothes, posed them in a formal setting, and created an image of respectable servitude. But Eliza subverted it, Marcus adds, looking at the photograph again. Look at how she positioned her hands. She made sure the scars were visible. She documented the abuse right there in the photograph Margaret Preston was commissioning to hide the abuse. Eliza was creating evidence, preserving testimony in the only way available to her. They search for what happened to Eliza and Thomas after March 1885 and find the story becomes even more complex and ultimately more hopeful than Eleanor had dared expect. Church records show that in April 1885, just 1 month after the photograph was taken, Eliza Freeman stopped attending Mother Emanuel AME Church. For months, there's no record of her whereabouts. Then Marcus finds something in the records of the Colored Women's Benevolent Association, a black mutual aid organization that operated in Charleston during this period. In their meeting minutes from August 1885, there's an entry. The association received a letter from Sister Eliza Freeman, formerly of Charleston, who reports that she and her son Thomas have successfully departed South Carolina and relocated to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Sister Freeman writes that she could not reveal her plans in advance for fear that her employer would prevent her departure or worse. She saved small amounts of money over many months, hiding it from her employer. When a traveling minister from Philadelphia visited our city in April, Sister Freeman approached him and requested assistance in relocating north. The minister and several families in Philadelphia's Negro community arranged transportation and temporary housing. Sister Freeman and Thomas departed Charleston by train in late April and arrived safely in Philadelphia in early May. Sister Freeman now works as a seamstress and reports that she and Thomas are establishing themselves in their new home, far from the violence they endured. Sister Freeman requests that we not share her location with anyone, as she fears her former employer may attempt to retrieve her or prevent others from following her example. The association celebrates Sister Freeman's courage and prays for her continued safety and prosperity. Eleanor and Marcus look at each other with growing excitement. Eliza had escaped. She had quietly planned and executed an escape from Margaret Preston's household, taking Thomas with her and fleeing all the way to Philadelphia to start a new life. The photograph, taken just 1 month before her escape, had documented the abuse she was fleeing, perhaps deliberately, as a final testimony before she disappeared. They search for Eliza and Thomas Freeman in Philadelphia records and find them in the 1890 census. Eliza Freeman, age 42, seamstress, residing on South Street in Philadelphia's substantial black community. Thomas Freeman, age 13, attending school. Both are listed as able to read and write. Over the next several weeks, Eleanor and Marcus continue tracing the Freeman family's story in Philadelphia. By 1900, Eliza owned her own small tailoring business. Thomas had completed 8 grades of school, remarkable for a black child in that era, and was working as a printer's apprentice. By 1910, Thomas was married and operating his own small printing business, and Eliza, now in her 60s, was living with Thomas's family. But the most important discovery comes when Marcus contacts a genealogist specializing in African American family histories. The genealogist traces the Freeman family forward and discovers that Thomas Freeman had 5 children, all of whom received education well beyond what was typical for black families in the early 1900s. One of Thomas's sons became a teacher, another a minister. Thomas's granddaughter became a social worker who specialized in helping domestic violence survivors. And crucially, the genealogist finds that Thomas Freeman's family still exists. His great-great-grandson, Dr. James Freeman, is a professor of African American history at Temple University in Philadelphia. Eleanor calls Dr. Freeman, her voice shaking with excitement. Dr. Freeman, my name is Dr. Eleanor Hayes from the Library of Congress. I've been researching your great-great-great-grandmother Eliza Freeman and your great-great-grandfather Thomas Freeman. I've discovered a photograph from 1885 that documents the abuse they suffered in Charleston before they escaped to Philadelphia, and I've found extensive records about their experiences and their courage in fleeing to freedom. James Freeman's response is immediate and emotional. Eliza Freeman. The family has always talked about her. My father told me she was a woman who survived terrible things in the South and brought her son north to give him a better life. We knew Thomas had a damaged hand that got passed down in family stories, but we never knew exactly what happened. We just knew Eliza was brave and that everything our family achieved started with her decision to escape. I have the evidence now, Eleanor says. I have a photograph showing the scars on Eliza's hands from years of abuse. I have letters where her employer admitted to beating her and deliberately injuring Thomas when he tried to defend his mother. I have church records documenting Eliza's suffering. And I have records showing how she quietly planned her escape and successfully brought Thomas to Philadelphia to start a new life. Dr. James Freeman travels to Washington 2 weeks later. Eleanor and Marcus have prepared a complete presentation of everything they've discovered. James examines each document with the careful attention of a historian and the emotion of a descendant, learning the full truth about his ancestors' suffering and courage. When he sees the 1885 photograph his great-great-great-grandmother Eliza with her scarred hands deliberately displayed, his great-great-grandfather Thomas standing protectively beside her with his damaged hand, James has to step back and compose himself. We always knew Eliza was strong, he says when he can speak. We knew Thomas was protective of his mother even as a child. But I never understood the full scope of what they survived. To be beaten for years, to have your hands deliberately broken for asking for fair wages or making a mistake, to have your 7-year-old son injured for trying to protect you, and then to find the courage to plan an escape and successfully execute it, bringing your child to safety, that's extraordinary. Eleanor shows him Margaret Preston's letters admitting to the abuse, the church records documenting Eliza's suffering, the Mutual Aid Society records celebrating her escape. She shows him the census records tracing Eliza and Thomas's success in Philadelphia, the evidence that Thomas received education and built a business, that Eliza lived to see her son prosper. Eliza didn't just survive, Marcus adds. She escaped, she thrived, and she built a legacy. Everything your family has achieved, your education, your career, your work documenting African American history, it all started with Eliza Freeman having the courage to save herself and her son and take them to a place where they could build something better. James nods, tears streaming down his face. My father used to say that Eliza taught our family to recognize injustice and have the courage to leave situations that are destroying us, even when leaving seems impossible. Now I understand what he meant. Eliza was trapped in an abusive situation with no legal protection, no resources, and a child to support, but she didn't accept that as permanent. She saved money in secret, made connections with people who could help, and executed an escape plan that took her and Thomas hundreds of miles to freedom. That took incredible courage and determination. Eleanor then asks the question she's been planning. Dr. Freeman, I'd like to create an exhibition about Eliza and Thomas's story about the violence that black domestic workers faced after emancipation, about the courage it took to escape such situations, and about the legacy of strength and determination that Eliza passed down to her descendants. Would you be comfortable with that? James looks at her with fierce determination. Not just comfortable, I insist on it. Eliza's story needs to be told. People need to understand that emancipation didn't end the violence and exploitation that black people faced. Domestic workers like Eliza lived in conditions that were barely different from slavery, trapped in white households, subject to violence with no legal protection, unable to leave because they had no alternatives. Eliza found a way out, but thousands of other black women didn't. Their stories deserve to be told too. Over the next months, Eleanor, Marcus, and James worked together to create the exhibition. They research other cases of black domestic workers who faced abuse in the post-emancipation South. They find dozens of similar stories, women beaten for minor infractions, workers who died from abuse that was never investigated, families that escaped north to cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago to flee the violence of the Jim Crow South. They also research the broader context of domestic servitude in the 1882 South. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, but the black codes and Jim Crow laws that followed created new systems of exploitation and control. Black domestic workers had few legal rights, no protection from abuse, and limited options for other employment. The system required them to live in their employers' homes, making escape difficult and leaving them vulnerable to constant violence and sexual assault. Eleanor and Marcus discovered that the experience Eliza Freeman endured was horrifyingly common. A study from the 1,890 seconds estimated that over 60% of black domestic workers in Charleston reported experiencing physical violence from their employers. Most never reported the abuse because they knew, as Eliza had learned when police dismissed the complaint filed on her behalf, that authorities would not protect black workers from white employers. But they also document the resistance. Black churches and mutual aid societies kept confidential records of abuse and helped some domestic workers escape. Black newspapers published anonymous accounts of violence in white households. And individual women like Eliza Freeman found ways to flee, taking their children to northern cities where they had more opportunities and at least somewhat better protection from violence. 11 months after Eleanor first opened that package from Charleston, the Library of Congress opens the exhibition, Marked by Violence, Freed by Courage, the story of Eliza Freeman and the black domestic workers of the Jim Crow South. The exhibition occupies a major gallery designed to honor victims of post-emancipation violence while celebrating resistance and survival. The centerpiece is the 1,885 photograph Eliza Freeman seated with her scarred hands deliberately displayed, Thomas standing protectively beside her with his damaged hand resting on her shoulder. A magnified detail draws attention to Eliza's hands, showing the extensive scarring across her knuckles and fingers. Beside it is an explanation. These scars document years of systematic violence. Eliza Freeman was repeatedly beaten by her employer, Margaret Preston, who targeted her hands as punishment for minor infractions. When Eliza's 7-year-old son Thomas tried to defend his mother, Mrs. Preston deliberately broke bones in his hand. 1 month after this photograph was taken, Eliza and Thomas escaped to Philadelphia, fleeing the violence that this image documents. The exhibition tells Eliza and Thomas's complete story through documents, testimony, and historical context. It displays Margaret Preston's letters where she casually admitted to beating Eliza and injuring Thomas, showing how white employers felt entitled to use violence against black domestic workers and face no consequences. One section focuses on the photograph itself and how Eliza subverted Margaret Preston's intention. The exhibition explains that Preston commissioned the photograph to prove she was a good employer, but Eliza positioned her hands to make the scars visible, creating documentation of abuse within an image meant to hide that abuse. Another section examines Eliza's escape, how she saved money secretly, made connections with people who could help, and successfully fled to Philadelphia with Thomas. The exhibition celebrates this as an act of tremendous courage, showing how difficult and dangerous it was for domestic workers to leave abusive situations. The exhibition includes extensive documentation of Eliza and Thomas's success in Philadelphia. Census records, business licenses, school records, and family photographs show how they built new lives. Thomas's education, his printing business, his marriage and children, all of it demonstrates what became possible when Eliza removed them from the violence of Charleston. A section on legacy features interviews with Dr. James Freeman and other descendants, explaining how Eliza's courage influenced multiple generations. James discusses how family stories about Eliza shaped his values and his career choice to document African American history. The exhibition also provides broader context about black domestic workers in the Jim Crow South, showing how common Eliza's experience was. Statistics, testimonies from other domestic workers, newspaper accounts, and church records document the systematic violence that thousands of black women faced in white households during this period. A video plays continuously, featuring historians and descendants discussing the system of domestic servitude that emerged after emancipation, the violence it entailed, the limited options for escape, and the courage of women like Eliza who found ways to free themselves and their children despite seemingly impossible obstacles. On opening day, Eleanor stands in the gallery watching visitors engage with the exhibition. She sees people study the photograph, understanding gradually what Eliza's scarred hands reveal, not just individual abuse, but a system that allowed white employers to beat black workers with impunity, that provided no legal protection or recourse, that trapped women like Eliza in situations that were barely different from slavery. Dr. James Freeman stands beside her, looking at his great-great-great-grandmother's photograph. Eliza was 37 years old in this picture, he says quietly. She'd endured years of beatings that left permanent scars on her hands. Her son had been injured trying to protect her. She was trapped in a situation that was slowly killing her. But 1 month after this photograph, she took the savings she'd hidden away and got herself and Thomas on a train north to freedom. She was terrified. Family stories say she was convinced they'd be caught and brought back, but she did it anyway. That's extraordinary courage. A young black woman approaches them, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for this," she says. "My grandmother was a domestic worker in the 1950 seconds, 70 years after Eliza Freeman. She told me stories about being mistreated by the white families she worked for, but I never fully understood what she endured or how brave she was to keep going. Seeing Eliza's story, seeing the scars, reading about what she survived, understanding how she found the strength to escape it, helps me honor my grandmother's courage too." An elderly white woman stops to read Margaret Preston's letters for a long time. Finally, she approaches Marcus. "My family employed black domestic workers in Charleston," she says. "I grew up thinking they were treated well, that they were like family. But reading these letters, understanding what women like Eliza Freeman actually experienced in white households, I realized my family's stories about how well they treated their servants were probably lies to make ourselves feel better about exploitation and abuse." "Yes," Marcus says gently, "that's a hard truth, but it's important to recognize it. The system of domestic servitude after emancipation was designed to perpetuate white control and black subordination. It required constant violence to maintain. And white families told themselves stories about how well they treated their servants to avoid confronting the reality of what they were doing. Throughout the day, visitors engaged deeply with the exhibition, reading every document, watching the videos multiple times, sitting in the memorial space with the weight of what they're learning. The photograph that seemed to show a formal portrait of a mother and son reveals itself to be something far more significant: documentation of abuse, evidence of courage, testimony preserved in scarred hands that told a story words couldn't safely speak in 1885 Charleston. As the museum prepares to close that evening, Eleanor walks through the gallery one more time. She stops in front of the photograph, looking at Eliza Freeman's direct gaze at the camera, at her scarred hands positioned deliberately to be visible, at Thomas's protective stance beside his mother. She thinks about Margaret Preston, who commissioned this photograph to hide her abuse, and instead inadvertently helped document it, who wrote letters casually admitting to violence because she never imagined she'd face consequences, who died without ever being held accountable for the years of brutality she inflicted on Eliza and Thomas Freeman. She thinks about the system that protected abusers like Margaret Preston, the police who dismissed complaints about her violence, the society that accepted beating servants as legitimate household management, the laws that provided no protection for black domestic workers from white employers' violence. And she thinks about Eliza Freeman, who endured years of systematic abuse, who watched her 7-year-old son injured for trying to protect her, who quietly planned an escape while continuing to serve the woman who beat her, who successfully fled to Philadelphia and built a life where she and Thomas could thrive and pass on a legacy of education, achievement, and courage to multiple generations. The photograph waited 139 years to reveal its full truth. The image that Margaret Preston commissioned to hide her abuse instead documented it permanently. Eliza Freeman's scarred hands, deliberately positioned to be visible in the portrait, preserved testimony that couldn't be spoken safely in 1885 but could finally be understood in 2024. Now the photograph has fulfilled a purpose Eliza surely intended when she positioned her hands so carefully during that sitting. The truth has been revealed, her suffering has been acknowledged, her courage has been celebrated, and her legacy has been honored. As visitors file past the image one last time, many pausing to look closely at Eliza's hands and Thomas's protective stance, Eleanor thinks about all the other photographs waiting to be examined, all the other domestic workers whose suffering was hidden in plain sight, all the other stories of violence and courage that deserve to be uncovered and told. Eliza Freeman's hands revealed a dark secret, systematic violence that was legal, common, and protected by a society that valued white authority over black lives and dignity. But those same hands also reveal strength, survival, and ultimately triumph. Eliza used those scarred hands to sew and earn money in Philadelphia, to build a life for herself and Thomas, to create a legacy that has lasted through 5 generations. Dr. James Freeman stands looking at the photograph one more time before leaving. "Every time I look at my own hands," he says, "I'll think about Eliza's hands and what they survived. And I'll remember that I can use my hands to write and teach and document history because Eliza used her scarred hands to bring Thomas North to a place where he could get education, where he could build something, where he could pass opportunities down to his children and grandchildren." Those scars tell a story of violence, yes, but they also tell a story of courage and love. A mother who endured unimaginable abuse and then found the strength to escape and give her son a chance at a better life. Eleanor nods, understanding. The dark secret revealed in Eliza Freeman's scarred hands was the violence of a system that made black women's bodies and lives disposable, that allowed white employers to beat servants with impunity, that provided no protection or justice for victims of abuse. But the deeper truth revealed in those hands was the strength it took to survive such violence, the courage required to escape, and the determination to build something better despite carrying permanent marks of trauma. Eliza Freeman's story, documented in a photograph, preserved in church records, revealed in an abuser's own letters, has finally been told fully and honestly. And Eleanor is grateful to have played a part in ensuring that Eliza's courage, Thomas's protective love, and the legacy they built together are remembered and honored across the generations, serving as testimony to both the horror of post-emancipation violence and the extraordinary strength of people who survived it and created better futures for their descendants.